Someone painted a swastika on his door. 2 days later, Marines were guarding his house. The black spray paint was still wet when 83-year-old Samuel Goldstein opened his front door at 6:47 a.m., the Nazi swastika dripping down the wood like fresh blood. His hands, the same hands that had liberated Dachau concentration camp 79 years ago, trembled as he stared at the symbol that had haunted his nightmares for 8 decades. But what Samuel didn't know was that his neighbor's security camera had captured everything, and within 48 hours, his quiet Chicago suburb would become a battleground between hate and honor. Welcome back to our channel, where we expose the stories that mainstream media won't touch. If you believe that our World War II heroes deserve better than this disgraceful treatment, slam that subscribe button right now. We're fighting back against hate with the truth, and we need your help to spread these stories. Before I tell you about the incredible chain of events that this act of cowardice set in motion, I need to know who's standing with me. Drop in the comments right now. How old are you and what city are you watching from? Your voice matters in this fight against the hatred that's poisoning our communities. Samuel Goldstein stood frozen on his doorstep in the pre-dawn darkness of Skokie, Illinois, his Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals feeling heavier than ever beneath his cardigan sweater. The swastika wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration of war against everything he'd fought for, everything his fallen brothers had died defending. At 83, Samuel was one of the last living liberators of the Nazi death camps, a man who'd seen evil in its purest form and spent his entire life fighting to ensure it never returned. "Not again," he whispered to the empty street, his voice carrying the weight of memories that most people couldn't imagine. "Not in America, not after everything we sacrificed." Samuel had moved to this quiet neighborhood 15 years ago, after his wife Rachel died, seeking peace in his final years. His neighbors knew him as the gentle old man who fed stray cats and helped with their groceries, but few knew the full extent of his wartime service. He'd been part of the 42nd Infantry Division that liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, one of the soldiers who'd walked into hell and emerged forever changed. Inside his modest home, the walls were covered with faded photographs and yellowing newspaper clippings documenting his unit's heroic actions. But the centerpiece of his living room wasn't a military decoration, it was a Torah scroll that had been hidden from the Nazis by a French rabbi, given to Samuel by a Holocaust survivor he'd helped liberate. Samuel carefully photographed the vandalism with his shaking hands, then sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. At his age, calling the police felt futile. What could they do? File a report? Promise to increase patrols? He'd seen enough hatred in his lifetime to know that bureaucratic responses rarely stopped bigots. But what Samuel didn't know was that his neighbor, Maria Santos, had been watching through her window. A young mother of 2 whose husband was deployed with the Marines in Syria, Maria had witnessed the entire attack at 3 a.m., but hadn't been able to get a clear look at the perpetrator's face. What she had gotten was crystal-clear security footage of the attack, and Maria Santos wasn't the type of woman to let hatred go unanswered. By 7 a.m., Maria was on Samuel's doorstep with a cup of coffee and a laptop computer. "Mr. Goldstein, I saw what happened. We're going to make this right." Samuel looked at the young Latina woman who'd become like a granddaughter to him, her eyes blazing with the same fire he'd once carried into battle. "Maria, it's just vandalism. At my age, I've learned to pick my battles." "Well, I haven't," Maria said firmly, opening her laptop. "And I know exactly who needs to see this footage." What Maria did next would transform a quiet suburban street into the front lines of a national conversation about hate, heroism, and the price of standing up for what's right. She uploaded the security footage to every social media platform she could access, but her caption was what made the video explode across the internet. "This is my 83-year-old neighbor, Samuel Goldstein. He liberated Nazi death camps in World War II and spent his life fighting the evil that murdered 6 million Jews. Last night, some coward painted a swastika on his door while he slept. Share this until we find who did it. Justice for Samuel. Never again. Veteran rights." If this doesn't make your blood boil, you're not paying attention. Hit that like button and share their story because we're about to show you what happens when Americans decide they've had enough of this garbage. Within 6 hours, the video had 100 views. By noon, it hit 500. By evening, over 2.3 million people had watched security footage of someone spray painting hate onto a World War II hero's front door. The hashtag Justice for Samuel was trending nationwide, and Samuel's quiet street in Skokie was about to become the center of a media firestorm. But the real explosion came when the video reached Staff Sergeant David Chen, a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton who'd been scrolling through social media during his lunch break. David's grandfather had also been liberated from a Japanese prisoner of war camp by American forces, and something about Samuel's story hit him like a physical blow. David didn't just share the video, he added his own message that would change everything. Marines, this is unacceptable. This hero liberated our people from Nazi death camps and some coward attacks his home. I'm driving to Chicago this weekend. Who's with me? Semper Fi means we never leave a brother behind, no matter how old. Marines for Samuel. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marines from across the Midwest began commenting, sharing, and making plans to converge on Skokie. Active duty, reserves, veterans, they all had the same message. Samuel Goldstein would not stand alone. But it wasn't just Marines. Army Rangers from Fort Bragg started organizing carpools. Navy SEALs from Norfolk began booking flights. Air Force pararescue teams from Colorado Springs cleared their weekend schedules. Within 24 hours, Maria's simple act of solidarity had sparked what military historians would later call the largest spontaneous veteran mobilization in peacetime history. Samuel had no idea what was coming. He spent Friday evening quietly cleaning the paint from his door with Maria's help, refusing her offers to call more neighbors or contact the media. He'd lived through Kristallnacht, the Holocaust, and decades of anti-Semitic attacks. She knew that drawing attention sometimes made things worse. Mr. Goldstein, Maria said as they scrubbed away the last traces of hate, I think you should know that a lot of people are upset about what happened to you. It's kind of you to care, dear, Samuel replied wearily. But I've learned that hate comes and goes in waves. This too shall pass. Maybe, Maria said with a mysterious smile. But this time, you won't be facing it alone. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly. Typical October weather in Chicago. Samuel woke early, as he always did, made his coffee, and settled into his recliner to read the newspaper. But at exactly 800 hours 8 a.m. civilian time, the sound of vehicles began rumbling down his quiet residential street. Samuel looked out his window and nearly dropped his coffee cup. A convoy of pickup trucks, motorcycles, and SUVs was parking along his street, and from each vehicle emerged men and women in military uniforms, Marines in their dress blues, Army soldiers in ACUs, Navy personnel in their service whites, Air Force airmen in their service dress. They moved with military precision, but their faces carried expressions of respect and determination that Samuel hadn't seen since the war. Staff Sergeant Chen approached Samuel's front door and knocked with formal military courtesy. When Samuel answered, the young Marine snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Sir, Staff Sergeant David Chen, United States Marine Corps. I'm here with about 200 of my closest friends to make sure nobody bothers you again. Samuel stared in shock at the young man whose grandfather he might have helped liberate decades ago. 200? But why? I'm just an old man who… Sir, with respect, you're not just an old man, Chen interrupted gently. You're a liberator. You're the reason my grandfather lived to start a family. You're the reason millions of people got to come home from hell. And anyone who wants to put hate symbols on your door is going to have to go through all of us first. What would you do if you saw a video of someone vandalizing a World War II veteran's home with Nazi symbols? Would you scroll past and hope someone else handles it? Or would you take action like these incredible service members did? Tell me in the comments what you think should happen to the cowards who attack our elderly heroes. What happened next became known as the Skokie Stand, a 48-hour vigil that transformed from a protective detail into a celebration of everything Samuel represented. The service members didn't just guard his house, they turned his front yard into an impromptu memorial to the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. Photos appeared from relatives of Holocaust survivors Samuel's unit had liberated. Stories were shared about the 42nd Infantry Division's heroic actions. Young Marines stood at attention while elderly veterans told them about the horrors they'd witnessed and the evil they'd defeated. But the most powerful moment came when Samuel finally emerged from his house to address the crowd that had gathered to protect him. Wearing his original Army uniform from 1945, his medals gleaming in the afternoon sun, the 83-year-old veteran walked slowly to his front steps. "I don't understand why you're all here," Samuel began, his voice carrying despite its age. "I was just doing my job. We all were. When we saw those camps, when we saw what they did to innocent people, we knew we were fighting for something bigger than politics or territory. We were fighting for the idea that evil cannot be allowed to triumph." The crowd of military personnel stood at perfect attention as Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've lived through the darkest chapters of human history. I've seen what happens when good people remain silent while hate spreads like poison. I've watched evil disguise itself as patriotism, as nationalism, as political necessity. But I've also seen the incredible courage of ordinary Americans who refuse to let darkness win." Samuel gestured to the service members surrounding his house. "You represent the best of America, the same spirit that drove us to storm the beaches of Normandy, to liberate death camps, to stand up to tyrants who thought they could break the human spirit. The person who painted that symbol on my door wanted to make me afraid. Instead, they reminded me why I'm proud to be an American." But the speech was interrupted by commotion at the end of the street. 3 pickup trucks with Confederate flag bumper stickers were approaching slowly, their occupants clearly agitated by the military presence. Samuel's neighbors had noticed the same group driving past his house repeatedly over the past few weeks, and Maria's security footage had captured one of the vehicles near Samuel's house on the night of the vandalism. Staff Sergeant Chen and his fellow Marines positioned themselves between the trucks and Samuel's house, their body language shifting from ceremonial to protective in seconds. The trucks stopped about 50 yards away, their engines running, windows down, occupants clearly debating whether to continue their approach. The standoff lasted several tense minutes before one of the truck doors opened. A heavy-set man in his 40s wearing military surplus gear stepped out, his face flushed with anger and what looked like alcohol. "This is still America," he shouted toward the crowd of service members. "Free speech means I can express my political views however I want. You can't intimidate patriotic Americans." Staff Sergeant Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying across the street with military authority. "Sir, vandalism isn't political expression, it's criminal activity. And terrorizing World War II veterans isn't patriotism, it's cowardice." The confrontation was escalating rapidly when an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Samuel himself walked slowly but deliberately toward the trucks, ignoring the protests of the Marines who wanted to keep him safe. "Young man," Samuel called out, his voice surprisingly strong, "I'd like to talk to you." The heavy-set man hesitated, clearly not expecting direct engagement from the elderly veteran. "I don't have to listen to you, old man. This is supposed to be a free country." "It is a free country," Samuel agreed, continuing his slow approach. "It's free because people like these Marines behind me and people like me 79 years ago were willing to fight and die to keep it that way. We fought against the very symbol you painted on my door." Samuel stopped about 10 feet from the truck, close enough to look the man directly in the eyes. "I was 19 years old when I walked into Dachau concentration camp. I saw children who looked like skeletons, families torn apart by hatred, human beings treated worse than animals. I saw what happens when symbols of hate become normalized, when political rhetoric turns into violence against innocent people." The man's aggressive posture was beginning to waver as Samuel continued. "You want to talk about patriotism? Real patriotism isn't about flags or symbols or who you hate. Real patriotism is about standing up for the values that make America worth defending. It's about protecting the weakest among us, not terrorizing them. It's about building bridges, not burning them. Samuel's voice grew quieter but more intense. I don't know what's happened in your life to fill you with so much anger. I don't know what you've been told about people like me. But I know that the America I fought for is big enough for both of you, as long as neither of us tries to destroy the other. The man stared at Samuel for a long moment, the weight of 8 decades of moral authority settling over the confrontation like a blanket. Behind Samuel, 200 service members stood silently, their presence a reminder that some principles are worth defending with your life. Finally, the man got back in his truck without another word. The 3 vehicles drove away slowly, their occupants subdued by an encounter they hadn't expected and couldn't easily dismiss. Subscribe to our channel right now if you believe that World War II heroes like Samuel deserve our protection and respect. We're building a community of people who refuse to let hate win, and every subscription helps us reach more people with stories that matter. The Skokie stand continued through Sunday, but it had evolved into something much more than a protective detail. Word had spread through the local Jewish community, and Holocaust survivors began arriving to meet Samuel and share their own stories with the young service members who'd come to defend him. Mrs. Ruth Goldberg, a 91-year-old Auschwitz survivor, brought photo albums showing her family before the war. This young man, she said, pointing to Samuel, his unit gave me back my life. I was 18, weighed 70 pounds, and had given up hope. When I saw American soldiers walking through those gates, I knew I would live to tell my story. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, an Army Ranger who'd driven from Fort Campbell, listened intently as Ruth described her liberation. Ma'am, my grandfather fought in the Pacific, but I never really understood what you all went through until today. This is why we survey to make sure this never happens again. The intergenerational conversation continued throughout the weekend as young military personnel learned firsthand about the evils their predecessors had fought to defeat. Social media documented every moment, spreading the message far beyond Skokie that America's military stood firmly against hatred and anti-Semitism. But the most impactful moment came when Samuel invited everyone inside his house to see his most treasured possession, the Torah scroll, given to him by the French rabbi. As the crowd of service members carefully filed through his small living room, Samuel told them the story of how the sacred text had been hidden from the Nazis for 4 years. This Torah represents everything we fought for, Samuel explained, his voice filled with emotion. It represents the idea that faith, culture, and human dignity can survive even the darkest evil. Every time someone tries to paint hate symbols on my door, they're really attacking this, the belief that all people deserve to live free from fear. Staff Sergeant Chen stood before the ancient scroll, tears in his eyes. Sir, my family is Buddhist, but I understand what this means. It's about the right to be who you are without fear. It's about protecting what makes us human. The weekend concluded with an impromptu ceremony on Samuel's front lawn. The service members had collected contact information from everyone present, creating a network of protection that extended far beyond the 48-hour vigil. Samuel would never again face hatred alone. As the various military units prepared to return to their bases and homes, Samuel stood on his front steps one final time to address the crowd that had transformed his quiet street into a symbol of American values. I came to this country as a young immigrant, drawn by the promise that anyone could become an American if they embraced our values of freedom and equality, Samuel said. I put on this uniform because I believed America was worth defending. Today, you've shown me that America is still worth defending, and that there are still Americans willing to do the defending. The formal ceremony concluded with something unprecedented. A 91-year-old Holocaust survivor and an 83-year-old World War II veteran standing together as active-duty service members from all branches rendered honors to the flag that Samuel had carried into battle 79 years earlier. But the story's impact extended far beyond one weekend in Skokie. Within days, Skokie stand chapters began forming at military bases across the country, dedicated to protecting elderly veterans from hate crimes and honoring their service. The Department of Veterans Affairs established a new program connecting young service members with aging veterans who lived alone and might be vulnerable to attacks. Most importantly, Samuel's story sparked a national conversation about the rise of anti-Semitic incidents and the responsibility of all Americans to stand against hatred. The video of his speech to the man with the Confederate flag went viral separately, viewed over 10 million times as people shared his message about the true meaning of patriotism. The investigation into the vandalism led to arrests of 3 local men with ties to white supremacist groups, but by then the focus had shifted from punishment to prevention. Samuel's house became an unofficial pilgrimage site for military families, Holocaust education groups, and anyone who wanted to meet a living link to America's greatest generation. 6 months later, Samuel received a letter that brought tears to his eyes. It was from the daughter of the man who had confronted him in the street that October day. "Mr. Goldstein," the letter read, "my father came home from your neighborhood very quiet and thoughtful. He spent the next week reading about the Holocaust and World War II. He's asked me to tell you that he's sorry for what he did and that he understands now what you and your generation sacrificed for all of us. He started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, and he says it's the first time in years he's felt proud of himself. Thank you for not giving up on him, even when he gave up on himself." Samuel kept the letter on his mantle next to his military decorations and the photograph of his unit liberating Dachau. It reminded him that hatred could be defeated not just with force, but with patience, courage, and the willingness to see humanity even in those who had temporarily lost their way. Here's my final question for all of you. When you see hatred targeting our elderly veterans, our Holocaust survivors, or any vulnerable members of our community, will you scroll past and hope someone else takes action? Or will you be like Staff Sergeant Chen and the hundreds of service members who proved that America still produces heroes willing to stand up for what's right? Tell me in the comments what you're prepared to do to protect the values that Samuel and his generation died defending. As Samuel approached his 84th birthday, his quiet house in Skokie had become a symbol of resistance against hatred and a testament to the power of ordinary Americans to do extraordinary things when their values are threatened. The swastika that was meant to terrorize him had instead awakened a sleeping giant of American decency that refused to let evil triumph. The young Marines who had driven from California to protect him remained in contact, calling weekly to check on his health and sending care packages during holidays. Maria Santos had become more than a neighbor. She was family, helping Samuel manage the hundreds of letters he received from people inspired by his story. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was Samuel's decision to spend his remaining years speaking at military bases, schools, and community centers about the dangers of hatred and the importance of standing up for vulnerable people. His message was simple but profound. Evil triumphs when good people choose silence. But America has never been a nation of silent people, and as long as we remember that, the light will always defeat the darkness. The last living liberators of Nazi concentration camps were disappearing, taking their first-hand knowledge of humanity's darkest chapter with them. But Samuel Goldstein's story ensured that their legacy of courage, sacrifice, and moral clarity would live on in a new generation of Americans who understood that freedom isn't free, it must be defended, protected, and passed down to those who come after. The swastika had been painted in hate, but it had been erased by love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between those who serve and those they protect. In the end, Samuel's door wasn't just cleaned, it was transformed into a symbol that hatred will always be outnumbered by those willing to stand against it.